Jackson's heart hammered against his ribs as 15 armed men surrounded the dilapidated farm he'd inherited, all because an old Palomino horse had discovered the $3 million secret hidden beneath the worthless land. The Decker family would stop at nothing to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs, leaving the giant cowboy with nowhere to run, and only Chester's uncanny intelligence standing between survival and certain death. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jackson Reeves didn't expect to inherit anything, let alone a dilapidated farm in the middle of nowhere. The letter had arrived 3 weeks ago, bearing the seal of Holloway and Partners attorneys at law. Inside was news that changed everything. His great-uncle Tobias, a man he'd met exactly twice in his life, had left him his entire estate. The inheritance included 500 acres of drought-ravaged land, a weathered farmhouse that had seen better days a century ago, and one aging Palomino horse named Chester. "Hell of a joke, Uncle Toby," Jackson muttered as he guided his truck down the winding dirt road that led to what was now his property. 6'6" of hard muscle, Jackson barely fit behind the steering wheel, his broad shoulders hunched slightly forward as he navigated the uneven terrain. At 35, he'd spent the better part of 2 decades working as a ranch hand across 3 states, saving every penny with dreams of someday owning his own land. Now he had it, but not in the way he'd imagined. The truck crested a small hill, and there it was. His inheritance spread out before him. The farmhouse stood like a lone sentinel against the vast prairie, its wood weathered to a silvery gray, windows dark and vacant. A dilapidated barn leaned precariously to one side, and various outbuildings dotted the property in various states of disrepair. And there, standing motionless in a small corral, was Chester, a once magnificent Palomino whose golden coat had faded with age. Jackson parked his truck and stepped out, boots hitting the dry earth with a soft thud. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the land, highlighting every crack and flaw in the structures before him. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the familiar ache that came from years of physical labor. This place was a mess, but it was his mess now. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he asked aloud as he approached the corral. Chester turned his head slowly, ancient eyes studying the newcomer with what Jackson could have sworn was skepticism. The horse snorted once, as if to say, "I was wondering the same about you." The attorney, a small, nervous man with perpetually sweaty palms, had explained that Tobias had lived as a recluse for the past 30 years, refusing most modern conveniences and keeping to himself. What he'd failed to explain was why the old man had left everything to a great-nephew he barely knew, rather than to someone closer. "Well, boy, I guess we're stuck with each other," Jackson said, reaching out a calloused hand toward the horse. Chester hesitated, then gently pressed his nose against Jackson's palm. It was a small gesture, but it felt like acceptance. The inside of the farmhouse was exactly what Jackson had expected: dusty, outdated, and filled with the accumulated belongings of a life lived in isolation. Old newspapers were stacked in precarious towers. Bookshelves sagged under the weight of countless volumes. The kitchen contained cooking utensils that belonged in a museum, but everything was meticulously organized, revealing a methodical mind behind the apparent chaos. That first night, Jackson slept on a narrow bed in what must have been Tobias's room, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the old house settling around him. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the empty landscape. Somewhere nearby, Chester moved restlessly in the corral, his hooves disturbing the packed earth. Morning revealed the true state of his inheritance in the harsh light of day. The roof needed extensive repairs. The plumbing was questionable at best. The electrical wiring would have given any inspector a heart attack. But as Jackson walked the property, coffee mug in hand, he began to see not just what it was, but what it could be. The land itself was good, despite years of neglect. With proper irrigation, the fields could produce again. The structures, while deteriorated, had been built solidly by someone who knew what they were doing. With enough time, money, and backbreaking work, this place could be transformed. "What do you think, Chester?" Jackson asked as he approached the corral again. "Worth saving?" The horse gazed at him steadily, then turned his head toward the eastern field, as if pointing. Jackson followed his gaze but saw nothing extraordinary. Just more overgrown land, stretching toward the horizon. The next week passed in a blur of physical labor. Jackson repaired the most critical issues with the roof, cleared decades of debris from the yard, and made the house marginally more livable. Each night, he collapsed into exhausted sleep, his massive frame barely fitting on the small bed. He developed a routine with Chester, morning and evening visits to the corral, one-sided conversations where Jackson talked about his plans for the farm and Chester listened with what seemed like genuine interest. On the 8th day, Jackson decided the old horse deserved better than the confines of the small corral. "How about a walk, old man?" he suggested, attaching a lead rope to Chester's halter. The horse perked up immediately, his ears swiveling forward with interest. They walked slowly, accommodating Chester's aged gait. Jackson's shirtless torso glistened with sweat under the hot sun, years of ranch work evident in every defined muscle. The neighboring property was miles away, one of the reasons Uncle Tobias had chosen this isolated spot, no doubt. As they approached the eastern field, the one Chester had seemed interested in before, the horse grew more animated. His pace quickened slightly and he pulled gently on the lead rope, clearly wanting to go in that direction. "Something over there?" Jackson asked, allowing himself to be guided. The field was overgrown with tall grasses and scattered wildflowers, nothing to distinguish it from any other part of the property. But Chester moved with purpose, leading Jackson to the remnants of an old fence line nearly hidden by vegetation. The horse stopped at a particular spot and pawed at the ground once, twice, insistent. "What is it, boy?" Jackson knelt down, pushing aside the tall grass where Chester had indicated. His fingers encountered something solid, a metal edge protruding slightly from the earth. Curious now, he cleared more of the surrounding area, revealing what appeared to be some kind of handle. It took considerable strength, even for someone of Jackson's size, to pull up what turned out to be a trapdoor, long concealed by dirt and vegetation. It opened with a protesting groan of rusted hinges, revealing a set of crude stairs descending into darkness. "What the hell did you find, Chester?" Jackson whispered, peering into the hidden entrance. The horse nickered softly, almost proudly. Jackson returned to the house for a flashlight, then, with Chester waiting patiently above, descended into his great-uncle's secret. The stairs led to a small underground room, perhaps 10 feet square, with walls of packed earth reinforced by wooden beams. In the center sat an old metal desk, and on it a leather-bound journal and a small wooden box. Jackson's hands, massive against the delicate items, carefully opened the journal first. The handwriting inside was tight and precise, page after page of calculations, coordinates and cryptic references, dates spanning decades, names he didn't recognize, and repeated throughout, one phrase that made little sense: the windmill synchronicity. When he finally turned his attention to the wooden box and lifted its lid, Jackson Reeves understood why his reclusive great-uncle had chosen him as his heir, and why Chester had been so insistent on showing him this place. Inside the box lay a map, several small keys, and a letter addressed simply, "To the one who follows the horse." Jackson's heart pounded as he climbed back up the stairs, the letter clutched in one hand, the box tucked securely under his arm. Chester waited exactly where he'd left him, ears pricked forward expectantly. "You knew about this all along, didn't you?" Jackson said, running a hand along the horse's weathered neck. Chester nickered softly, almost like laughter. Let's head back to the house. We've got some reading to do. The sun was setting as they made their way across the property, casting long shadows that stretched their figures into giants across the prairie. Jackson couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation mixed with unease. What secret had his eccentric great-uncle hidden away, and why had he been chosen to discover it? Back at the farmhouse, Jackson settled at the kitchen table, the items from the underground room spread before him. He opened the letter first, unfolding the yellowed pages with careful fingers despite their size and strength. To the one who follows the horse, it began in the same precise handwriting as the journal. If you're reading this, then Chester has deemed you worthy. Don't underestimate that old horse. He's smarter than most people I've known and a far better judge of character. Jackson glanced up at Chester, who had followed him into the house and now stood patiently in the doorway, watching. The horse blinked slowly as if encouraging him to continue. My name, as you likely know, is Tobias Reeves. What you may not know is that I wasn't always a recluse. Once I was an accomplished geologist with a particular interest in undiscovered mineral deposits. 40 years ago, I made a discovery on this land that I chose to keep secret for reasons that will soon become clear. Beneath the eastern fields of this property lies a vein of gold unlike anything documented in this region. My initial estimates valued it at approximately $3 million, though with current market values it may be considerably more. The map enclosed will lead you to the primary survey points where I confirmed the deposit's boundaries. Jackson's breath caught in his throat. Gold? $3 million worth of gold beneath this neglected farm? It seemed impossible, yet the detailed calculations and coordinates in the journal suddenly made sense. He continued reading, his massive hands trembling slightly. I never extracted more than a few samples, enough to confirm the quality and value. You may wonder why I chose to live simply, even poorly, atop such wealth. The answer lies in what happened after my discovery. 3 men, business partners I had unwisely confided in, attempted to steal my findings and claim the land for themselves. When legal means failed them, they resorted to threats, then violence. I survived their attack but realized that any public claim to the gold would put not only myself but innocent others in danger. The men believed they had destroyed all evidence of my discovery after ransacking my office in town. They never knew about this property, which I purchased under a separate family name. Here I continued my research in secret while living as the eccentric hermit everyone assumed me to be. Jackson ran a hand through his short dark hair, trying to process everything. The letter continued, naming the 3 men, Harold Wingate, Thomas Blackburn, and James Decker, all prominent businessmen in the nearest city some 40 miles away. Tobias detailed how he had monitored them from afar for decades, gathering evidence of their other crimes and misdeeds, creating a comprehensive file that could destroy them if necessary. 2 of these men are now dead, the letter explained. Only James Decker remains, aged and wealthy from a lifetime of similar schemes. His son, Marcus, now manages their family enterprises with the same ruthless approach as his father. A chill ran down Jackson's spine. The Decker name was well known throughout the region. They owned half the businesses in the county and had influence that stretched to the state capital. I've watched you from afar, Jackson, the letter continued, surprising him with the direct address. You're the only family member with both the physical capability and moral character this situation requires. Your strength of body is evident, but I've also observed your strength of character during the times our paths crossed briefly. You work hard, speak honestly, and stand your ground when necessary, traits this task will demand. Chester snorted and stamped a hoof, as if in agreement with Tobias's assessment. The decision of what to do with this information is now yours. The gold remains undisturbed where nature placed it. The evidence against the Decker family is contained in a safety deposit box At First National Bank in the city, the smallest key will open it. The other keys are for various storage locations noted on the map. The letter concluded with a warning. Trust Chester. He has been my companion and protector for 15 years. He knows this land better than any human could, and his instincts about people have never failed me. Whatever you decide, be careful. Wealth of this magnitude changes everything and everyone. Jackson set the letter down, his mind reeling. He looked at Chester, who gazed back steadily. "Well, old-timer," he said, "seems like we've got ourselves a situation here." He turned his attention to the map, studying it carefully in the fading evening light. It showed the 500 acres with detailed markings of underground features, not just the gold vein, but water sources, caverns, and what appeared to be an extensive tunnel system beneath parts of the property. Several locations were marked with small red X's, each with a corresponding note and key number. As darkness fell completely, Jackson lit the oil lamps that Tobias had apparently preferred to electric lighting. In their warm glow, he pored over the journal, trying to make sense of the cryptic references to the windmill synchronicity. From what he could gather, it referred to a specific alignment that occurred only twice yearly, during the spring and fall equinoxes, when the shadows of the property's 3 windmills converged at a particular point, revealing the primary entrance to the tunnel system that led directly to the richest part of the gold vein. The nearest equinox was just 2 weeks away. Jackson closed the journal and walked to the window, looking out at the dark silhouettes of the decrepit windmills barely visible against the night sky. They hadn't turned in years, their mechanisms rusted and blades damaged. "Guess I know what needs fixing first," he murmured. Chester had made himself comfortable on the worn rug near the fireplace, but his ears remained attentive to Jackson's every move. "Tomorrow we'll check out those storage locations," Jackson told the horse. "See what else Uncle Tobias left for us." He knelt beside Chester, his large frame folding awkwardly to bring himself to eye level with the resting animal. "You really did know him well, didn't you? And now you're stuck with me instead." The horse lifted his head slightly and bumped Jackson's shoulder with his nose, a gesture that felt remarkably like reassurance. That night, Jackson slept fitfully, his dreams filled with underground tunnels, spinning windmills, and shadowy figures pursuing him across endless fields. He woke at dawn, the weight of his unexpected inheritance feeling heavier than before. This wasn't just about a rundown farm anymore. It was about a fortune in gold, a decades-old conflict, and potential enemies he hadn't known existed until yesterday. And somehow, an aging Palomino horse was his guide through it all. The morning air was crisp as Jackson loaded the necessary tools into his truck. After a simple breakfast, he'd studied the map more carefully, identifying 3 storage locations marked within the property boundaries. According to Tobias's notes, they contained equipment and supplies that might prove useful, or necessary, for accessing the gold. "Ready for an adventure, Chester?" Jackson asked as he approached the corral. The horse was already waiting at the gate, as if he'd known the day's plans before Jackson had even decided them. The first storage location was a small shed behind the barn that Jackson had previously dismissed as just another dilapidated outbuilding. From the outside, it appeared unremarkable: weathered gray boards, a rusted metal roof, and a padlock so corroded it seemed it would crumble at a touch. But as Jackson inserted the corresponding key from Tobias's collection, he found the lock turned smoothly, its decrepit appearance merely a clever disguise. Inside, the shed was immaculately organized. Tools hung on the walls in neat rows, specialized mining equipment, geological survey instruments, and what appeared to be custom-made devices whose purposes weren't immediately evident. Shelves lined the back wall, holding boxes of supplies, first aid kits, and batteries. In one corner stood a generator covered with a tarp but appearing well-maintained. Uncle Toby was prepared for everything, Jackson muttered, examining a rack of heavy-duty flashlights. Chester, who had followed him into the shed, moved to a stack of bound papers on a small desk and nudged them with his nose. "What's this, boy?" Jackson asked, picking up what turned out to be detailed schematics for the 3 windmills on the property. Each page was meticulously drawn and annotated with maintenance notes and repair procedures. Attached was a smaller envelope containing photographs of the windmills in working condition, taken at various times over the past 30 years. Jackson gathered what he needed from the shed: tools for the windmill repairs, several flashlights, and the schematics. As he locked the door behind them, he noticed Chester was already moving purposefully toward the next location marked on the map. "You really do know this place inside and out, don't you?" Jackson said, following the horse across a stretch of overgrown field toward a rocky outcropping that formed a natural boundary on the western edge of the property. The second storage site was more cleverly concealed, a small cave entrance hidden behind a growth of shrubs and wild grasses. Jackson had to clear away considerable vegetation before the opening became visible. Chester waited patiently as the massive cowboy worked, occasionally stepping forward to pull at a particularly stubborn root with his teeth. Inside the cave, the air was cool and dry. Jackson's flashlight beam revealed a space about 15 feet deep and 10 feet wide. Metal shelving units had been bolted to the rock walls, and on them sat rows of sealed containers. Opening one, Jackson discovered preserved food, enough to last months. Another contained medical supplies. A third held ammunition for various firearms, and a fourth was filled with clothing and blankets. He was building a bunker, Jackson realized aloud, a place to hide if things went wrong. At the back of the cave, a steel lockbox caught his attention. The key slid into its lock smoothly, revealing contents that made Jackson's breath catch. Several gold samples, each labeled with coordinates and dates, alongside a leather pouch containing cut gemstones. "These must be from the vein," Jackson whispered, holding one of the gold samples to the flashlight. It gleamed richly, impressively pure. He carefully returned everything to the lockbox and secured it again. This wasn't the time or place to examine such valuable items further. The third location marked on the map was the most mysterious, a simple X in the middle of a grazing field with no visible structure nearby. As Jackson and Chester approached the spot, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just more overgrown prairie grass and scattered wildflowers. Chester stopped precisely at the marked location and pawed the ground insistently. Jackson knelt down, feeling through the grass until his fingers encountered something solid, a metal handle similar to the one they'd found the day before, but smaller. This trap door was better concealed and better maintained than the first. It opened silently on well-oiled hinges, revealing not a room but a narrow metal tube with a ladder descending into darkness. "You stay here this time, boy," Jackson told Chester, who snorted in what seemed like disapproval, but remained above ground as Jackson lowered himself into the passage. The ladder extended about 20 feet down, ending in a narrow tunnel that ran straight for perhaps 50 yards before opening into a small chamber carved directly from the bedrock. Unlike the other storage locations, this one contained only a few items: a powerful amateur radio set, a locked cabinet that presumably held weapons, and a desk containing logbooks filled with decades of observations. Jackson flipped through the most recent logbook, finding entries dated just months before Tobias's death. Many referenced Decker activities, notes about property purchases, business dealings, and movements of individuals identified only by initials. Tobias had been conducting surveillance on his enemies for decades, meticulously documenting what appeared to be a pattern of suspicious activities and land acquisitions throughout the region. The final entry, dated just 2 weeks before Tobias died, read simply, "MD making inquiries about neighboring properties. Time grows short. Horses ready." MD Marcus Decker and horses ready surely referred to Chester's preparation for his role in revealing the secret to Tobias's heir. Jackson climbed back to the surface, his mind churning with questions. Chester was waiting exactly where he'd left him, but the horse's demeanor had changed. Ears alert, body tense, eyes fixed on something in the distance. Following the animal's gaze, Jackson spotted a black SUV moving slowly along the public road that bordered the northern edge of the property. Even at this distance, he could see the driver was surveying the farm through binoculars. "Company already," Jackson muttered, instinctively moving to place his bulk between Chester and the distant vehicle. "Let's get back to the house." They returned to find Jackson's truck with a flat tire, too precise to be accidental. Someone had been on his property while he explored the storage locations. A warning, perhaps, or simply surveillance to see what the new owner was doing. That afternoon, Jackson began work on the first windmill. The structure was in better condition than it appeared from a distance. The main issues were rusted components in the turning mechanism and damaged blades that needed replacement. Following Tobias's schematics, Jackson found that his uncle had cleverly designed the windmills to appear more decrepit than they actually were, with key components protected from the elements by unobtrusive covers. As Jackson worked, stripped to the waist in the afternoon heat, his powerful muscles gleaming with sweat, Chester grazed nearby, occasionally looking up to check the road. No more vehicles passed, but both man and horse remained vigilant. By sunset, Jackson had made substantial progress on the first windmill. The turning mechanism was repaired, and 2 of the damaged blades had been replaced with spares he'd found in the equipment shed. At this rate, he might have all 3 windmills operational before the equinox. Exhausted but satisfied, Jackson headed back to the house with Chester following at his side. As they approached, Jackson noticed something on the porch that hadn't been there before: a small box wrapped in plain brown paper. Chester stopped, refusing to go closer, his posture communicating clear distrust. "Message received," Jackson said quietly. He circled around to the back of the house, entering through the kitchen door and making his way cautiously to the front. Through the window, he could see the package still sitting innocuously on the porch. No name, no postage, no markings of any kind. Just a box, deliberately placed where he would find it. Someone knew he was here, someone was watching, and they had just made their first move. Jackson studied the package through the window, debating his options. Every instinct told him not to touch it, but ignoring it wouldn't make the threat disappear. Chester remained in the yard, his entire posture radiating distrust of the mysterious delivery. After retrieving a pair of work gloves and a broomstick from the kitchen, Jackson cautiously opened the front door. He used the stick to nudge the package, half expecting an explosion or some other immediate danger. When nothing happened, he carefully lifted it with the broomstick's end, noting its unexpected weight. Back inside with the doors locked, Jackson placed the package on the kitchen table and carefully cut away the brown paper wrapping. Inside was a wooden box with a simple brass latch. He hesitated, then lifted the lid. The box contained a single gold nugget, roughly the size of a golf ball, nestled on black velvet. Beneath it lay a handwritten note on expensive stationery. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Mr. Reeves. Perhaps we should discuss mutual interests. M.D. Marcus Decker," not even bothering with subtlety. Jackson examined the gold nugget, turning it over in his massive palm. It was unmistakably similar to the samples in Tobias's lockbox, which meant Decker knew about the deposit. The question was how much he knew and how he'd learned of it. A soft nickering from the kitchen doorway announced Chester's presence. The horse had somehow managed to open the back door and was now watching Jackson with intelligent eyes. "What do you think, Chester? Should we discuss mutual interests with the man who might have had something to do with Uncle Toby's death?" Chester snorted and tossed his head, about as clear a no as a horse could give. "My thoughts exactly," Jackson agreed, returning the nugget to its box. He wouldn't respond to this opening gambit, wouldn't acknowledge receipt of the message. Let Decker wonder about his reaction. That night, Jackson reviewed more of Tobias's journals, searching for information about the extent of the gold deposit and any insights into the Decker's knowledge of it. The entries painted a disturbing picture of a family that had built its fortune through intimidation, manipulation, and occasionally violence, all while maintaining a respectable public image. Marcus Decker had taken over the family enterprises 5 years earlier when his father James had suffered a stroke. Under his leadership, Decker Industries had expanded aggressively, buying up land throughout the county, often from owners who had mysteriously experienced runs of bad luck before selling at below-market prices. The most recent entries documented Marcus's growing interest in properties adjacent to Tobias's land, a pattern suggesting he was piecing together the location of the gold vein through geological surveys and perhaps inside information from county offices. Jackson slept fitfully, waking at dawn to the sound of Chester's urgent whinnying from outside. He grabbed the shotgun he'd found in Tobias's bedroom closet and moved quickly to the front porch. In the gray morning light, he saw the reason for Chester's alarm. A drone hovered about 50 feet above his property, its camera clearly focused on the windmills. As Jackson watched, the device made a slow, deliberate circuit of the area, paying particular attention to the spots where he'd been working the previous day. Surveillance, Jackson muttered, not even trying to hide it. The drone completed its reconnaissance and moved away toward the north, the direction of the Decker estate, according to the local map Jackson had studied. Chester pawed the ground anxiously, his gaze following the departing device. "We're on a clock now, boy," Jackson told the horse. "They know I'm working on the windmills, which means they suspect what they're for. We need to get all 3 operational before they make their next move." After a hasty breakfast, Jackson turned his attention to the second windmill. This one was in worse condition than the first, with severe damage to its vane and tail assembly. According to Tobias's schematics, this middle windmill was the most critical. It cast the shadow that would align with the others during the equinox, revealing the tunnel entrance. The work was challenging, requiring Jackson to climb the 30-foot tower multiple times, carrying heavy replacement parts. His powerful frame was advantageous for the task. Where another man might have struggled with the weight of the steel components, Jackson managed them with relative ease, though not without effort. Chester remained close throughout the day, grazing nearby but always alert, frequently raising his head to scan the surroundings. Twice he nickered a warning that preceded vehicles passing on the distant road, giving Jackson time to position himself less visibly. By mid-afternoon, Jackson had repaired the main mechanism of the second windmill, but still needed to replace the damaged blades. As he worked on the ground, preparing the replacement parts, the sound of an approaching vehicle caught his attention. Unlike the previous observers, this one turned onto the property's access road. Jackson quickly gathered his tools and moved to stand beside Chester, one hand on the horse's neck, the other ready to reach for the pistol now tucked into his waistband. A dusty pickup truck appeared around the bend in the drive, slowing as it approached. It wasn't the black SUV from the previous day, but Jackson remained wary, positioning himself slightly in front of Chester as if to shield him. The truck stopped about 30 feet away and a woman stepped out, mid-30s, dressed practically in jeans and a work shirt, with a weathered face that suggested a life spent outdoors. She held up her hand slightly, showing she was unarmed. "Mr. Reeves? Jackson Reeves?" Her voice carried clearly across the distance between them. "That's me," Jackson acknowledged, not moving from his defensive position. "My name's Sarah Mitchell. I was your uncle's veterinarian." She nodded toward Chester. "I've been taking care of this old fellow for years. Tobias had me on a regular schedule. When I heard there was someone new at the property, I thought I should stop by to check on Chester." Chester's reaction was immediate and clear. He whickered softly and stepped forward, ears pricked with what appeared to be recognition and welcome. "He knows you," Jackson observed, relaxing slightly but maintaining his caution. "We're old friends," she confirmed, still keeping her distance respectfully. "May I approach him?" Jackson hesitated, then nodded, watching carefully as she walked slowly toward them. Chester met her halfway, nudging her shoulder affectionately when she reached him. "Hey, handsome," she murmured, running professional hands along his neck and withers. "You're looking good for an old man." "How long did you work with my uncle?" Jackson asked, studying her face for any sign of deception. "About 10 years, she replied, continuing her examination of Chester. "I came out every 2 months, regular as clockwork. Tobias was particular about Chester's care." She glanced up at Jackson. "He didn't trust many people, your uncle, but he trusted me with his horse, which says something." "He left me a letter," Jackson said carefully, watching her reaction. It mentioned that Chester was important. Something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps. "Did it mention me?" "No," Jackson admitted. "Should it have?" She finished her examination of Chester before answering. "Tobias and I had an understanding. I looked after Chester, and I didn't ask questions about certain things." She straightened up, meeting Jackson's gaze directly. "Like why a reclusive old man needed his horse in perfect health when he rarely went anywhere, or why Chester was trained to respond to unusual commands, or why Tobias made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd make sure Chester was properly introduced to whoever inherited this place." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "What kind of unusual commands?" Sarah glanced around, suddenly seeming aware of how exposed they were. "Maybe we should continue this conversation inside." Jackson hesitated, then nodded. Chester followed them without prompting as they walked toward the house. Inside, Sarah declined Jackson's offer of coffee, but accepted a glass of water, sitting at the kitchen table, while Chester positioned himself near the doorway as if standing guard. "Tobias was paranoid," she began. "Most people thought it was just an old man's eccentricity, but I'm guessing you've discovered it wasn't entirely unfounded." "You could say that," Jackson agreed, deciding to test her. "Did you know about the gold?" If she was surprised by his directness, she didn't show it. Not specifically. Tobias never said gold, but he made references to something valuable on the property, something others wanted. "The Deckers," Jackson supplied. She nodded. "Mainly them, yes. They've been buying up land all around this county for years. Tobias was convinced they were after something specific." "And Chester's role in all this?" Sarah smiled fondly at the horse, who was watching them intently. "Chester is special. Tobias trained him himself, using methods I've never seen before. He's responsive to specific commands, can recognize certain patterns, and has an almost uncanny ability to sense danger." She paused. "Has he shown you anything on the property?" "Any locations?" "The underground room," Jackson confirmed, watching her reaction carefully. "I figured as much." She reached into her pocket and removed a small leather pouch. "Tobias gave me this about 6 months ago. Said if anything happened to him, I should wait for his heir to arrive, make sure Chester accepted them, and then give them this." She slid the pouch across the table to Jackson. Inside was a small brass whistle with unusual markings etched along its surface. It looked old, possibly handcrafted. "It's a special signal whistle," Sarah explained. "Chester responds to specific patterns. Tobias said it might be necessary when the time comes, whatever that means." Jackson turned the whistle over in his palm. "Did my uncle say anything else about what might happen after he was gone?" Sarah hesitated. "He was increasingly concerned in the months before his death. Said Marcus Decker had gotten hold of some old geological surveys that would lead him to start asking questions about this property. She met Jackson's gaze directly. Tobias's death was ruled natural causes, but I had my doubts. He was in good health for his age, and the timing was suspicious. Did you share these doubts with anyone? The sheriff? He plays poker with Marcus Decker every Thursday. She shook her head. In this county, the Deckers might as well be royalty. Jackson considered this information. Sarah Mitchell seemed genuine, and Chester's trust in her was evident, but caution had become second nature since arriving at the farm. I appreciate you coming by, he said finally. And I'm glad Chester has someone looking after his health, but I'm still trying to figure out exactly what I've inherited here, and who I can trust. Understandable. She stood, leaving her glass on the table. Chester trusts me, and Tobias did too. That's all I can offer as credential. She pulled a card from her pocket and placed it beside the glass. My number's on there. Call if Chester needs anything, or if... She glanced meaningfully at the whistle. You need assistance with other matters. After Sarah left, Jackson examined the whistle more closely. The markings appeared to be some kind of notation system, perhaps indicating different whistle patterns for different commands. What else do you know, boy? He asked Chester, who had moved to stand beside him, ears pricked with interest at the sight of the whistle. What else did Uncle Toby teach you? On impulse, Jackson brought the whistle to his lips and blew a simple pattern, 2 short bursts followed by 1 long. Chester's reaction was immediate. He trotted to the front door and looked back expectantly. You want me to follow you? Jackson asked, intrigued. Outside, Chester led him directly to the first windmill, the one Jackson had already repaired. The horse circled its base once, then stopped and pawed the ground at a specific spot. Jackson knelt down, searching the area Chester indicated. Brushing away dirt and grass revealed a small metal plate embedded in the ground, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. It took Jackson's considerable strength to pry it open, revealing a narrow compartment containing an oiled canvas package. Unwrapping it carefully, Jackson found a precision-engineered device that looked like a surveyor's tool, along with a handwritten note in Tobias's now familiar script. Position at base of Windmill 1 during alignment. The shadow will reveal the path. The device appeared designed to mount somehow onto the windmill's base, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Jackson spent the rest of the day working on the second windmill, completing the blade replacements just as the sun began to set. Only one windmill remained, and the equinox was just 12 days away. That night he tried another whistle pattern, 3 short bursts. Chester led him to a different location entirely, a spot near the old barn where another hidden compartment yielded a set of hand-drawn maps showing what appeared to be tunnel systems beneath the property. The tunnel entrances were marked with cryptic symbols rather than specific locations, security through obscurity. After studying the maps for hours at the kitchen table, Jackson finally understood the significance of the windmill synchronicity. During the equinox, the 3 windmills would cast shadows that aligned precisely to reveal the main tunnel entrance. The other entrances, marked on the maps with symbols, would only be identifiable once the main entrance had been located and the proper measurements taken from that reference point. Tobias had created an elaborate puzzle that required both physical objects, the windmills, the measuring device, and knowledge, the equinox timing, Chester's assistance, to solve. Anyone missing a single piece would search fruitlessly. The drone returned the next morning, this time accompanied by the black SUV, which slowed as it passed the property. Jackson kept working on the third windmill, pretending not to notice the surveillance, but positioning himself so his broad back was toward the road, obscuring details of his work. When the vehicle finally moved on, he pulled out his phone and, after a moment's hesitation, dialed Sarah Mitchell's number. "I need information," he said when she answered. Everything you know about Marcus Decker, his routine, his security, who works for him. That sounds like you're planning something risky, she replied carefully. Knowledge is power, Jackson countered. And right now he has more of both than I'm comfortable with. There was a pause before she answered. Meet me at the diner in town tomorrow morning at 7. We shouldn't discuss this over the phone. The remainder of the day passed without further surveillance, allowing Jackson to make significant progress on the third windmill. By nightfall, the structure was nearly operational. He'd need just a few more hours the following day to complete it. As he worked, Chester remained nearby, occasionally bringing Jackson tools by carrying them carefully in his mouth, displaying an intelligence and helpfulness that continued to impress the cowboy. "We make a good team, old-timer," Jackson told him as they headed back to the house in the gathering darkness. That night, a thunderstorm rolled in, rattling the windows of the old farmhouse and illuminating the repaired windmills in brief, stark flashes of lightning. Jackson sat at the kitchen table, cleaning the shotgun while reviewing Tobias's journal entries about the Deckers. A particularly loud thunderclap startled him, and then he realized Chester was making noise too, whinnying urgently from the front room. Jackson grabbed the shotgun and moved silently to join the horse, who was staring intently out the window. In the next flash of lightning, Jackson saw them, 3 figures moving across his property toward the windmills, rain-slicked ponchos making them seem almost ghost-like in the momentary illumination. "Looks like Decker got tired of surveillance," Jackson muttered, checking that the shotgun was loaded. He glanced at Chester, whose ears were flattened against his head. "What do you think, boy? Should we go introduce ourselves properly?" Jackson moved silently through the house, his size belying his ability to move without making a sound, a skill honed during years of hunting. He pulled on a raincoat, tucked the shotgun inside, and turned to Chester. "Stay here," he whispered. Chester snorted and moved toward the door, clearly intending to follow. Jackson recognized the futility of arguing with the stubborn animal and instead reached for the whistle Sarah had given him. He tried another pattern, 1 short, 1 long, 1 short, hoping it might signal Chester to remain quiet. The horse immediately stilled, his posture alert but silent. Another useful command to remember. Jackson slipped out the back door into the driving rain. The darkness between lightning flashes was absolute, allowing him to move across the yard unseen. He circled wide, using his knowledge of the property to approach the intruders from behind. Another lightning flash illuminated the scene. 3 men examining the second windmill. One held what appeared to be a measuring device, while another was attaching something to the base of the structure. The third kept watch, a rifle slung across his back. Jackson waited for the next thunderclap, then moved closer, using the rolling boom to mask any sounds of his approach. He positioned himself behind an old tractor, close enough to hear snatches of conversation between thunderclaps. Not what Decker said would be here. Looking for some kind of marker or alignment. Just finish planning the charges and get out. Charges. They weren't just inspecting the windmills, they were planning to destroy them. The next flash of lightning revealed what Jackson had feared, blocks of explosive being attached to each windmill's base. If detonated, they would bring down the structures Jackson had worked so hard to repair and eliminate the possibility of the equinox alignment. Jackson weighed his options. He was outnumbered but had the element of surprise. He could confront them, but that would reveal his knowledge of the windmill's importance. He could call the sheriff, but Sarah's warning about the lawman's connection to Decker gave him pause. As he deliberated, the decision was made for him. The man keeping watch turned suddenly, peering through the darkness directly toward Jackson's hiding place. In the next lightning flash, their eyes met. "We've got company," the lookout shouted, swinging his rifle around. Jackson didn't hesitate. He fired the shotgun into the air, not aiming to hit anyone, but the thunderous boom and muzzle flash in the darkness created momentary chaos. He immediately changed position, moving to another vantage point as the intruders scrambled for cover. "Who's there?" one of them called out, trying to sound authoritative despite the quaver in his voice. Jackson remained silent, circling to approach from a different angle. These were hired hands, not hardened killers. Their nervousness was evident in their body language. "Mr. Decker just wants to talk," another voice called. "No need for this to get ugly." A brilliant idea struck Jackson. Using the darkness between lightning flashes, he moved to a position that would put the farmhouse at his back. When the next flash came, he stood to his full height, deliberately silhouetting his massive frame against the skyline, an intimidating figure in the storm, shotgun held casually in one hand. "Tell Decker if he wants to talk, he can come himself." Jackson's voice boomed across the property, amplified by the acoustics of the storm. "These are my windmills on my land. Touch them again, and our next conversation won't involve words." He punctuated his statement with another shotgun blast into the air, then used the darkness to change position once more. The intimidation worked. Within minutes, the three men were scrambling back to their vehicle, leaving their explosives behind in their haste to retreat. Once they were gone, Jackson carefully removed the explosive charges from each windmill. They weren't sophisticated devices, simple remote-triggered demolition charges that would have been effective, but weren't designed for anything more complex than destroying property. Back at the house, Jackson found Chester waiting anxiously by the door. The horse greeted him with a relieved nickering sound, pushing his nose against Jackson's shoulder as if checking him for injuries. "I'm all right, boy," Jackson assured him, peeling off his dripping raincoat. "But we've got a problem. Decker's not just watching anymore, he's taking action." The next morning dawned clear after the storm, revealing muddy footprints and tire tracks that confirmed the night's events hadn't been a product of Jackson's imagination. He photographed everything with his phone before the evidence dried in the morning sun. At 7 sharp, Jackson entered the town diner, a small establishment with vinyl booths and the smell of coffee and bacon permeating the air. Several heads turned as he walked in, his towering frame and muscular build drawing the usual attention from strangers. He spotted Sarah in a corner booth and joined her, his back to the wall, giving him a clear view of the entrance. "You look like you had an eventful night," she observed, noting the dark circles under his eyes. "Decker sent some men to plant explosives on the windmills," Jackson replied quietly, accepting the coffee the waitress poured without looking away from Sarah's face. He watched her reaction carefully. Her surprise seemed genuine. "He's escalating faster than I expected," she murmured, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. Tobias predicted this might happen if someone started repairing the windmills. "How much do you actually know about all this?" Jackson asked directly. Sarah sighed. "More than Tobias wanted me to, probably. I pieced things together over the years. The gold, the Decker's interest, the windmill alignment." She met his gaze. "I was Tobias's only real connection to the outside world toward the end. He trusted me with Chester, which meant he had to trust me with some of the context." She slid a folder across the table. "This is everything I could gather about Marcus Decker, his schedule, properties, known associates." She tapped a particular page. "Pay attention to this. Decker's throwing a charity fundraiser at his estate 3 days from now. Every important person in the county will be there." "Including the sheriff," Jackson noted, scanning the guest list. "Exactly. It might be your best opportunity to work on the final windmill without surveillance. They'll all be occupied for hours." Jackson studied her. "Why are you helping me?" "Tobias was my friend," she said simply. "And I've watched the Deckers crush too many people in this county. Someone needs to stand up to them." After breakfast, they drove separately back to the farm. Sarah examined Chester thoroughly, pronouncing him in excellent health despite his age. He's been well cared for his entire life, she explained, running expert hands over the horse's legs. Tobias saw him as a partner, not just an animal. I'm starting to understand why, Jackson said, watching Chester's intelligent eyes track their conversation. As Sarah prepared to leave, she paused by her truck. The equinox is 9 days away. Once those windmills are aligned, you'll need to move quickly. Decker won't give up easily. I'll be ready, Jackson assured her, though I'm still not sure what I'm going to find. Whatever it is, Sarah replied, Tobias thought it was worth protecting with his life. Remember that. After the night's confrontation, Jackson focused on completing the third windmill, working with renewed urgency. The explosive charges he'd removed were stored safely in Tobias's underground bunker, potential evidence, though Jackson doubted the local authorities would be interested in pursuing the matter. Chester stayed close as Jackson worked, occasionally disappearing only to return with tools before Jackson realized he needed them. The horse's ability to anticipate his requirements was uncanny, reinforcing Jackson's growing conviction that Chester was far more than an ordinary animal. By midday, Jackson had made significant progress on the final windmill. The mechanical components were repaired, leaving only the blade assembly to complete. As he worked, stripped to the waist in the afternoon heat, he became aware of a vehicle approaching, not from the main road but from a rarely used track that bordered the western edge of the property. Chester noticed it too, his ears pricking forward as he raised his head to stare intently in that direction. Jackson casually picked up the nearby rifle he'd taken to keeping within reach, positioning it against the windmill's base as he continued working. The approaching vehicle turned out to be Sarah's truck. She parked a reasonable distance away and approached on foot, carrying what appeared to be a picnic basket. "Thought you might be hungry," she called as she drew nearer, "and I wanted to check if you had any unwelcome visitors after last night." Jackson relaxed slightly, though he noted Chester remained somewhat alert, not suspicious of Sarah but still monitoring their surroundings. "That's thoughtful," Jackson said, accepting the basket. Inside were sandwiches, fresh fruit, and a thermos of coffee. "And no, it's been quiet. Too quiet, actually." They sat in the shade of the windmill to eat, Chester grazing nearby but always keeping them in sight. "I did some digging into those charges they left behind," Sarah said between bites. "They're a specific type used primarily by a demolition company owned by Westlake Construction." "Let me guess, a Decker subsidiary?" Sarah nodded. "Marcus Decker acquired it about 3 years ago. They specialize in clearing land for development projects." Jackson considered this. So if the windmills had been destroyed, it would have looked like standard demolition of unsafe structures on a newly inherited property. Exactly. Clean, deniable, and it would reset your progress significantly. She studied him. "You've nearly finished all 3 windmills. That's impressive work for one man." Jackson glanced up at the structure towering above them. "Uncle Toby designed them well. Once I understood the mechanisms, the repairs weren't complicated, just physically demanding. And physical demands aren't much of an issue for you," Sarah observed with a slight smile, her eyes briefly taking in his muscular frame before returning to her sandwich. The comment hung between them for a moment before Jackson redirected the conversation. "Tell me more about this charity event at Decker's estate." Sarah seemed relieved by the change of subject. "Annual affair, very exclusive. Every influential person in the county attends, politicians, business owners, old money families. It's partly philanthropy, mostly networking and power display." "And you think it's my opportunity to finish the windmills without surveillance?" "Decker never misses an opportunity to show off his estate and influence. He'll be occupied hosting for at least 5 hours." She hesitated. "I could get you an invitation if you wanted to attend instead." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Me? At a black tie charity gala?" "You're a landowner now," she pointed out, And it might be strategic to observe Decker on his home turf. See who he talks to, gauge his priorities. Jackson considered it, running a hand through his short dark hair. I don't exactly have a tuxedo in my saddlebags. There's a decent menswear shop in town, though finding something in your size might be challenging. After lunch, Sarah helped Jackson work on the windmill, proving surprisingly knowledgeable about mechanical systems. With her assistance, the work progressed faster than he'd anticipated. Tobias taught me a bit about these, she explained, when he commented on her expertise. He needed someone who could help maintain them if he became unable to do so himself. He planned for everything, didn't he? Jackson marveled. Everything except dying before he could extract the gold himself, Sarah said quietly. Or maybe that was part of his plan too. Maybe he was waiting for someone he could trust to help finish what he started. As the sun began to set, they had completed nearly 80% of the third windmill's repairs. Another day's work would see it finished, well ahead of the equinox timeline. Sarah declined Jackson's invitation to stay for dinner, citing evening appointments, but promised to return with that charity invitation if he decided he wanted it. After she left, Jackson spent the evening reviewing more of Tobias's journals, focusing on entries that mentioned the windmill's synchronicity. According to his uncle's calculations, the alignment would occur precisely at 5:17 p.m. on the equinox. The shadows would remain aligned for approximately 8 minutes, a narrow window to locate and mark the entrance. Chester, who had made himself comfortable on the rug near Jackson's chair, suddenly lifted his head, ears alert. A moment later, Jackson heard it too, the distinctive drone of an approaching helicopter. Moving to the window, he watched as a sleek black helicopter passed over the property at low altitude, clearly conducting surveillance. It circled once around the windmills before continuing toward the north in the direction of the Decker estate. Escalating indeed, Jackson muttered to Chester. I think we'd better take Sarah up on that invitation. Know your enemy and all that. The next morning, Jackson drove into town for the first time since arriving at the farm. The small community of Riverton consisted of a main street lined with weathered but well-maintained buildings, most dating from the early 1900s. The locals stopped to stare as Jackson's imposing figure emerged from his truck outside the menswear shop. Newcomers were rare enough, but one of Jackson's size was a spectacle. The shop owner, a thin elderly man with precise movements, took one look at Jackson and sighed dramatically. Special order, he declared without preamble. Nothing off the rack will fit those shoulders, but... He circled Jackson appraisingly. I might have something in the back. Previous customer, similar build, though not quite as tall. Left town suddenly about 10 years ago. Never collected his order. The suit in question was a dark charcoal gray, beautifully tailored though slightly dated in style. With minimal alterations that the shopkeeper promised to complete by the following afternoon, it would fit Jackson well enough for the charity event. As he was leaving the shop, Jackson noticed a black SUV parked across the street, its tinted windows preventing him from seeing the occupants. The same vehicle from his property's surveillance, he was certain. Rather than appear concerned, Jackson walked directly toward it, his stride purposeful. The SUV's engine started immediately, and it pulled away before he reached it, a small victory that brought a grim smile to his face. At the farm, Jackson found Sarah waiting, her expression troubled. Chester stood nearby, clearly agitated. What happened? Jackson asked, immediately alert. Someone was here while you were gone, she said. Chester was highly disturbed when I arrived. I checked the windmills, they're untouched, but I found these. She held out her hand, showing several small electronic devices. Surveillance bugs. Jackson identified them immediately. They're watching the property. And listening, Sarah added grimly. They were placed strategically around the house and windmills. Jackson examined the surveillance devices Sarah had discovered, his expression hardening. They're getting desperate. Or confident, Sarah countered. These aren't amateur devices. Military grade from what I can tell. Jackson crushed one between his fingers, the delicate electronics no match for his strength. We need to be careful what we say and do on the property from now on. They swept the house and outbuildings thoroughly, finding and removing a dozen more bugs. Jackson kept one intact, placing it near a radio he tuned to a country music station. Let Decker's people listen to that for a while. The charity event is tomorrow night, Sarah said as they finished their sweep. Are you still planning to attend? Jackson nodded. I think it's time Marcus Decker and I met face to face. I'll pick you up at 7, she replied. Try not to intimidate the entire county elite with those shoulders. After Sarah left, Jackson took Chester for a ride around the property perimeter, staying far from the windmills and house where additional surveillance might be hidden. The horse moved with surprising agility despite his age, responding to the slightest pressure from Jackson's knees, almost as if he could anticipate his rider's intentions before they were communicated. They stopped at the eastern edge of the property, overlooking a valley that stretched toward distant mountains. Jackson dismounted, allowing Chester to graze while he sat on a boulder, considering his situation. In less than 3 weeks, he had inherited a farm, discovered a secret gold deposit, made enemies with the most powerful family in the county, and formed an unlikely partnership with an extraordinary horse. Now he was preparing to attend a black-tie charity event to confront the man who might have had his uncle killed. Life takes strange turns, doesn't it, boy? He said to Chester, who looked up from grazing as if he understood perfectly. The next evening, Jackson stood on his porch wearing the altered suit from town, the charcoal gray fabric stretched across his broad shoulders, the tailoring doing what it could to accommodate his muscular frame. He'd managed to tame his usually unruly dark hair and had even found an old straight razor in Tobias's bathroom to give himself a proper shave. Sarah arrived precisely at 7, her truck replaced by a modest sedan that wouldn't attract attention at the affluent gathering. She stepped out wearing a simple but elegant black dress, her usually practical appearance transformed. You clean up well, Cowboy, she remarked, her eyes taking in the transformation. Could say the same about you, Doc, Jackson replied, suddenly feeling self-conscious about his size in the formal attire. The suit fit as well as could be expected, but he still felt like a bull in a china shop. Before leaving, Jackson slipped the brass whistle into his pocket and went to Chester, who was watching from the corral. Keep an eye on things, he told the horse, only half joking. Chester nickered softly, bumping his nose against Jackson's shoulder in what felt like reassurance. The Decker estate was everything Jackson had expected, ostentatious wealth displayed through manicured grounds, a mansion that could house 50 comfortably, and security that would make most government buildings seem lax. Floodlights illuminated the approach where valets took cars from arriving guests. Invitations? A suited security guard asked as they approached the entrance. Sarah presented the embossed cards she'd somehow procured. The guard examined them, his eyes lingering suspiciously on Jackson's imposing figure before reluctantly waving them through. Inside, the mansion's grand ballroom was filled with the county's elite, dressed in their finest and engaged in the delicate dance of social politics. Servers circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres, while a string quartet played classical music that barely carried over the buzz of conversation. There's our host, Sarah murmured, nodding discreetly toward a man holding court near the center of the room. Marcus Decker was younger than Jackson had expected, early 40s, trim and handsome in a calculated way, his tailored tuxedo and perfect smile projecting success and confidence. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, spending precisely the right amount of time with each important guest. Let's circulate, Jackson suggested. I want to observe a bit before introducing myself. For the next hour, they moved through the party separately, Jackson listening more than talking, gathering impressions and information. The conversations around him painted a clear picture. Marcus Decker was feared, respected, and in some cases despised, but no one crossed him openly. "That's Jackson Reeves," he overheard someone murmur as he passed. "Inherited old Tobias's worthless property." "Not so worthless from what I hear," another voice responded. "Decker's been trying to buy that land for years. Wonder if the nephew knows why." Jackson eventually found himself near a display of framed maps and photographs, a historical exhibit of the county's development. One map in particular caught his attention, a geological survey from 40 years earlier, showing mineral deposits throughout the region. A section covering Tobias's property had been subtly altered, he realized, understating the potential resources there. "Admiring our local history, Mr. Reeves?" The voice was smooth, cultured, and carried an undercurrent of steel. Jackson turned to find Marcus Decker standing beside him, champagne flute in hand and calculated smile in place. "Just getting acquainted with the area," Jackson replied evenly, "since it's my home now." "For how long, I wonder?" Decker sipped his champagne. "Maintaining such a property requires significant resources. I understand it's quite dilapidated." "I'm making improvements," Jackson said. "The windmills, for instance, are coming along nicely." A flicker of something, irritation, concern, crossed Decker's perfectly composed features. "Ah, yes, those ancient structures. Safety hazards, really. I'd be happy to send my demolition team to remove them for you, free of charge." "That's generous," Jackson replied, holding Decker's gaze. "But I've grown attached to them." "Attachments can be expensive," Decker remarked, his smile never reaching his eyes, particularly when they involve historical artifacts. The conversation had shifted to thinly veiled threats, Jackson realized. "I've never been afraid of expense when it comes to preserving what's valuable. A commendable philosophy." Decker nodded to someone across the room. "Though sometimes what appears valuable is merely fool's gold. A pleasure meeting you, Mr. Reeves. Do enjoy the party." As Decker walked away, Sarah appeared at Jackson's side. "That looked intense," she murmured. "Establishing boundaries," Jackson replied quietly. "He knows exactly what's on the property." "Of course he does. The question is how far he'll go to get it." She glanced around. "We should leave soon. You've been noticed by everyone who matters," which was the point. Before they could move toward the exit, the sheriff approached, a heavy-set man with a florid face and the forced joviality of someone accustomed to wielding power. "You must be Tobias Reeves's nephew," he boomed, extending a hand. "Sheriff Mike Hollister. Sorry about your uncle. Peculiar old fellow, but never caused any trouble." Jackson shook the offered hand, noting the sheriff's assessing gaze. "Appreciate the condolences, Sheriff. I'm finding Uncle Toby left quite a legacy." "So I hear," Hollister replied, his jovial tone unchanged while his eyes hardened. "Word of advice, son. This county runs smoother when folks understand how things work. Your uncle managed to fly under the radar, but you're making quite a splash. Some ripples reach farther than you might expect." "I'll keep that in mind," Jackson said evenly. As they drove back to the farm, Sarah broke the tense silence. "You've been officially warned by both Decker and his pet sheriff in one evening. That's almost impressive." "They're worried," Jackson observed, "and the equinox is 5 days away and the windmills are almost ready. Whatever advantage Tobias built into this system, they haven't figured it out yet." The final days before the equinox passed in a blur of preparation and vigilance. Jackson completed the repairs on the third windmill by working through the night, his powerful frame silhouetted against floodlights he'd set up. If Decker's men were watching, and he was certain they were, let them see. The message was clear. He wouldn't be intimidated. Sarah visited daily, bringing supplies and news from town. The charity event had sparked considerable gossip about Jackson's confrontation with Decker. Opinion was divided. Some admired anyone who stood up to the family's influence, while others predicted Jackson wouldn't last a month. "They're taking bets at the hardware store," Sarah reported with grim amusement. "Odds are 3-1 against you keeping the farm by summer." "Good thing I've never been concerned with odds," Jackson replied, adjusting the alignment mechanism on the second windmill. With Chester's help, he'd been testing different positions, finding the optimal angle for the upcoming alignment. Chester had proven invaluable during the preparations. The horse seemed to understand exactly what they were working toward, often positioning himself where the shadows would fall during the equinox, giving Jackson reference points for his adjustments. His behavior became increasingly purposeful as the day approached, as if he sensed the culmination of years of preparation. 2 days before the equinox, Jackson rose before dawn to find Chester already awake and alert, standing at his bedroom window and nickering softly to wake him. "What is it, boy?" Jackson asked, immediately alert. The horse moved toward the front door, his intention clear. Jackson dressed quickly and followed, grabbing the shotgun as he went. Outside, the eastern sky showed the first hints of approaching sunrise, the air cool and still. Chester led him directly to the second windmill, the critical one in the alignment sequence. In the dim pre-dawn light, Jackson saw what had alarmed the horse. The alignment device he'd installed the previous day had been tampered with, subtly adjusted by perhaps half a degree, enough to ruin the precise shadow alignment during the equinox. "Clever," Jackson muttered, examining the sabotage. It was expertly done, nearly undetectable. If Chester hadn't alerted him, he might not have noticed until it was too late. He fixed the alignment, then checked the other windmills, finding similar subtle adjustments. Each had been manipulated just enough to prevent the perfect alignment Tobias had designed. As Jackson worked, the rising sun revealed fresh footprints around each structure. Someone had visited during the night, moving with expertise and purpose. Back at the house, Jackson called Sarah. "They're getting desperate," he told her. "Professional sabotage now, not just thugs with explosives." "It makes sense," she replied, her voice tense. "Decker's geological surveys probably tell him there's something valuable there. But without the windmill alignment, he can't pinpoint the exact location. His father spent decades trying to find it. We need to watch the windmills constantly until the equinox," Jackson decided. No more chances for sabotage. That night, Jackson set up a rotation with Sarah. 4 hours on, 4 hours off, keeping constant vigil. During his watch, Jackson circled the property continuously, his rifle slung across his back, Chester often walking beside him. The horse's senses were sharper than his, detecting movement or unusual sounds long before Jackson could. During Sarah's watch, Jackson tried to sleep but found himself too wired, reviewing Tobias's notes for any details he might have missed. The journals described the tunnel system in detail, an extensive network extending beneath the property, with the main entrance revealed only during the equinox alignment. According to Tobias, the primary gold vein was accessible through a specific tunnel branch that would be marked during the alignment. At dawn on the day before the equinox, Jackson was completing a perimeter check when Chester suddenly froze, ears forward, eyes fixed on the approaching road. Minutes later, a convoy of 3 vehicles appeared: the black SUV that had been surveilling the property, a large truck with equipment visible in its bed, and a police cruiser. "Here we go," Jackson muttered, positioning himself near the first windmill, his stance deliberately casual despite the rifle in his hands. The vehicles stopped at the property line. Sheriff Hollister emerged from the cruiser, adjusting his belt over his substantial girth before approaching the fence line. "Morning, Reeves," he called, his tone falsely friendly. "Need to have a word with you." Jackson walked to meet him, stopping a prudent distance away, Chester at his side. "Something I can help you with, Sheriff?" "Got a court order," Hollister announced, waving a document. Environmental inspection. These old windmills of yours have been reported as potentially containing hazardous materials. Lead paint, asbestos, that sort of thing. Need to take samples immediately. It was a transparent ploy. One day before the equinox, suddenly there was an environmental concern that couldn't wait. That's interesting, Jackson replied evenly, especially since I had them professionally inspected just last week. Got the certification right in the house. Want to see it? The sheriff's expression faltered momentarily. He hadn't expected documentation. Still need our own inspection. County regulations. You'll need to give proper notice, Jackson countered. My lawyer was very clear about that. 24 hours minimum for non-emergency inspections. This is an emergency, Hollister insisted, his friendly facade slipping. Public safety concern. Then you'll need to demonstrate probable cause of imminent danger, Jackson replied, silently thanking Tobias for the legal reference materials he'd left in the house. Otherwise, I'm within my rights to refuse entry until proper procedures are followed. Behind the sheriff, Marcus Decker emerged from the SUV, his expression controlled but eyes cold with frustration. The men who had exited the truck, wearing coveralls marked with a county logo but carrying equipment that looked nothing like environmental testing gear, exchanged uncertain glances. You're making a mistake, Reeves, Decker called. This can go easily or very, very hard. That sounds remarkably like a threat, Mr. Decker. Sarah's voice came from behind Jackson. She had arrived unnoticed during the confrontation and was recording the exchange on her phone, especially combined with this falsified court order. She held up her phone, showing the screen. I just confirmed with Judge Weber's clerk. He issued no such order. He's actually at a judicial conference in Denver until next week. The sheriff's face flushed dark red. Now, see here? No, you see, Sarah interrupted. I'm live streaming this to several locations, including the State Attorney General's office. They've been quite interested in Riverton County's unusual legal procedures lately. It was a bluff, a convincing one based on the sudden uncertainty on Decker's face. Legal scrutiny was the last thing he wanted. We'll be back, Decker said finally, his voice tight with controlled rage, with proper documentation. I'm sure you will, Jackson replied. The day after tomorrow would work well for me. After the convoy departed, Sarah lowered her phone with a shaky laugh. That was closer than I'd like. They're not done, Jackson warned, watching dust rise from the retreating vehicles. That was just the legal approach. They'll try something else before the equinox tomorrow. Then we don't sleep tonight, Sarah decided. Neither of us. Chester nickered in apparent agreement, bumping his nose against Jackson's arm. That night, they positioned themselves strategically, Jackson near the windmills, Sarah at the house with a clear view of the approach road. Both were armed, though Jackson hoped it wouldn't come to violence. The night passed in tense vigilance. Twice, Chester alerted to movement in the darkness, but each time it proved to be wildlife. A coyote, then a small herd of deer passing through the property. As dawn broke on the day of the equinox, Jackson allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. They had made it through the night without incident. The windmills stood ready, their mechanisms repaired, their alignments precise according to Tobias's specifications. In less than 12 hours, the shadows would align to reveal what his uncle had protected for decades. But as the sun cleared the horizon, casting long shadows across the property, Jackson spotted a dust cloud approaching from the north, larger than any previous convoy. Through binoculars, he counted at least 6 vehicles heading toward the farm. They're coming in force, he told Sarah grimly, and I doubt they're bringing paperwork this time. Jackson's muscles tensed as he watched the approaching convoy. The time for legal maneuvering and subtle intimidation had passed. Decker was making his final play for the gold. "We need to buy time until 5:17, he told Sarah. "Once we know the tunnel entrance location, they can't take that knowledge from us." She nodded grimly, checking the rifle Jackson had given her. "I'll call the state police, but they won't get here for at least an hour." Chester pawed the ground anxiously, his intelligent eyes tracking the dust cloud. Jackson knelt beside the horse, retrieving the brass whistle from his pocket. "Time to see what other tricks Uncle Toby taught you," he said, blowing a complex pattern Sarah had identified in Tobias's notes as the emergency protocol. Chester's reaction was immediate and astonishing. He galloped toward the barn, disappearing inside. Moments later, a series of loud mechanical sounds echoed across the property, gears turning, engines starting. "What the—" Sarah began, but Jackson was already moving toward the barn. Inside, Chester stood beside an exposed control panel previously hidden behind a false wall. The horse had somehow triggered it with his teeth. Indicator lights blinked as ancient machinery hummed to life beneath the barn floor. "Defense systems," Jackson realized, spotting Tobias's handwriting on a faded schematic posted beside the panel. He wasn't just paranoid, he was prepared. They rushed outside as the approaching vehicles entered the property. The convoy consisted of 3 SUVs, 2 pickup trucks full of men, and a bulldozer. Marcus Decker rode in the lead vehicle, his face visible through the windshield, cold determination etched in every feature. As the vehicles approached the central clearing near the windmills, the ground beneath them suddenly shifted. Hidden panels in the earth dropped away, creating a series of deep trenches that caught the first 2 vehicles, bringing them to an abrupt halt. The bulldozer narrowly avoided the trap but became boxed in as more panels opened strategically around it. "That won't hold them long," Jackson noted as men began piling out of the trapped vehicles, weapons visible in their hands. "Get to the house and keep trying the state police." The standoff that followed was tense but static. Decker's men, numbering at least 15, established positions around the trapped vehicles, while Jackson covered the windmills, his rifle prominent but not yet raised. The message was clear. Further advancement would escalate the situation beyond mere intimidation. Marcus Decker emerged from his SUV, expression livid as he surveyed the damaged vehicles. "This ends now, Reeves," he shouted across the distance. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Jackson called back. "A man so desperate for gold, he'd commit murder for it, just like your father did." Decker's face contorted with rage. "You know nothing about my father." "I know Tobias Reeves documented everything," Jackson replied. "Every threat, every scheme, every illegal land grab. Documents that will go public if anything happens to me or this property." It was partly a bluff. The documentation existed, but Jackson hadn't yet secured its release in case of his death. Still, the uncertainty was enough to make Decker hesitate, conferring hurriedly with Sheriff Hollister, who had emerged from one of the rear vehicles. The standoff continued for hours, a careful dance of position and counterposition. Neither side advanced, but neither retreated. Jackson moved between defensive positions, using his size and the farm's terrain to create the impression of multiple defenders. Chester remained near the windmills, seemingly unbothered by the tension, occasionally wandering between them as if checking their alignment. Several times, Decker's men aimed weapons at the horse, only for Jackson to make his presence known, with warning shots into the ground nearby. As afternoon waned, Jackson checked his watch, 4:45 p.m. The alignment would occur in just over 30 minutes. Decker would be growing desperate, knowing his window of opportunity was closing. "Last chance, Reeves," Decker finally called. "Name your price. Everyone has one." "Not interested in selling," Jackson replied simply. "This land stays in the family." Decker's response was to signal his men. They began advancing slowly, using the vehicles as cover. The confrontation was approaching its breaking point. At that moment, distant sirens pierced the air, multiple vehicles approaching fast. Sarah had gotten through to someone. The effect on Decker's operation was immediate. Men began retreating toward their vehicles, urgency in their movements. Sheriff Hollister rushed to Decker's side, gesturing frantically toward the approaching sirens. "This isn't over," Decker shouted as he was hustled into an SUV that hadn't been disabled. "That gold belongs to me by right." Within minutes, the convoy had hastily reassembled, maneuvering around the trapped vehicles and retreating down the access road, just as 3 state police cruisers appeared on the horizon. "Perfect timing," Sarah called from the porch, lowering her phone. "The Attorney General's office has been very interested in our county's unusual law enforcement practices." By the time the state troopers arrived, Jackson had a compelling story ready. Armed trespassers had invaded his property, led by Marcus Decker, who appeared to believe there was gold on the land. "Happens sometimes in these parts," the lead trooper noted, taking statements. "People get gold fever based on old legends. They usually don't bring bulldozers and armed men, though." While the troopers documented the scene, Jackson kept one eye on his watch. 5:10 p.m. The alignment was approaching. "We need to check something," he told Sarah quietly when they had a moment alone. "Keep the troopers occupied for a few minutes." As Sarah engaged the officers with paperwork and details of Decker's previous harassment, Jackson moved to the windmills where Chester was already waiting, his attention fixed on the setting sun. The 3 windmills stood in perfect alignment, their shadows lengthening across the field as the sun descended toward the horizon. Jackson positioned himself where Tobias's notes indicated, the measuring device from the hidden compartment in his hands. At precisely 5:17 p.m. the magic happened. The shadows of the 3 windmills converged at a single point, creating a pattern on the ground that resembled an arrow. Jackson quickly marked the spot with stakes as Chester pawed the ground in apparent approval. When the shadows shifted just 7 minutes later, there was no visible evidence of what had occurred, except for Jackson's markers and the knowledge he'd gained. Later that evening, after the state troopers had departed with promises to investigate Decker's actions, Jackson and Sarah returned to the marked location with shovels and Chester keeping watch. "Uncle Toby was clever," Jackson remarked as they dug. "The windmills don't point to the main tunnel entrance. They point to the map that leads to all the entrances. 2 feet down they found it, a waterproof metal container holding detailed tunnel maps, keys, and instructions for safely accessing the gold vein, estimated at just over $3 million in value." "What will you do with it?" Sarah asked as they examined the discovery by lantern light. Jackson looked around at the farm, the land he'd come to love, the windmills he'd repaired with his own hands, the house that was beginning to feel like home. Then he looked at Chester, who had been his guide and protector throughout. Use some to fix up this place properly, he decided. Set aside a trust for Chester to ensure he has the best care for the rest of his days. He glanced at Sarah. "Maybe hire a local veterinarian as a consultant." She smiled. "And the rest?" Jackson's eyes drifted to the distant road where Decker's convoy had retreated. "Finish what Uncle Toby started. Use the evidence he gathered, along with Decker's actions today, to break the family's hold on this county. That might be worth more than gold in the long run." As moonlight bathed the old farm in silver, Jackson stood with Chester at his side, Sarah nearby, looking toward the future that had unexpectedly become his. The windmills turned slowly in the night breeze, their shadows now simple silhouettes against the moonlit ground, their secret shared and their purpose fulfilled. Sometimes inheritance came in unexpected forms: a dilapidated farm, an extraordinary horse, a hidden fortune, and most importantly, a chance to right old wrongs and build something lasting on a foundation of justice rather than greed. Chester nickered softly and nudged Jackson's arm as if in agreement.